The rest of the story. Jim was being a nuisance. So much of one that Mr. Durband, the director of the school play, stopped the rehearsal cold. What seemed to be the problem? Mr. Durband asked. And Jim, eyes dancing with mischief, pointed to himself, feigning astonishment that he had been singled out as the cause of some disturbance. Of course, Jim was quite often the cause of some disturbance, especially of late, so it was only reasonable that the weary director proceed, as in fact he did. For the better part of 2 hours, Jim had been making half-whispered wisecracks, Dr. Durband observed, and then he exclaimed, "There will be no further disruptions this evening. Is that quite clear?" And Jim nodded, suddenly sober-faced, and assured Mr. Durband that he understood. And at that moment, the director felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the harmlessly troublesome teenager. You see, Jim had auditioned for the part of the Earl of Warwick, an important role in Shaw's classic St. Joan. But along with the many talented young thespians trying out was the particularly gifted Peter Sissons, and it was he who got the part. So, Jim was given the inconsequential, non-speaking role of a monk who appears only in the final scene of the play, standing in the background and thus presumably disappointed and restless. Did he irresistibly interject irreverent asides throughout rehearsals? Oh, I must have a talk with that young man, Mr. Durband silently decided. And so at 8 p.m., following the evening's rehearsal in privacy, he did. The director said, choosing Peter over you was nothing personal. And the boy rather unconvincingly said that was all right, it didn't matter. "It's your voice," continued Mr. Durband. "You speak so softly most of the time, down in your throat, swallowing your words, that what you're saying doesn't carry across the room, much less across the footlights." But what could he do about it, Jim beseeched. The director studied Jim's expression and realized therefrom how very much this meant to the young man. "Being heard takes more than being loud," he said. Certainly Peter Sissons had a big voice, but it was his personality, his passion to make himself understood, that projects what he says all the way to the back row. Well, Jim took it all to heart, and he disrupted rehearsals no further. And what do you know, the night of the play, he seemed content to stand quietly peering from the cowl of the monk's cloak. Now, Peter Sissons, who magnificently portrayed the Earl of Warwick, he became a newscaster one day, I once heard someone say. And Jim, whatever happened to him? Well, his voice has been heard many times around the world. For once upon a lesson profoundly learned, there was an aspiring young actor turned troubadour who impressed himself on his own and on each subsequent generation as few in all history have. But the next time you reflect on that personality impeccably projected, you will hear amused in your mind's ear an English schoolboy swallowing his words, belying the brilliant future of Jim. James Paul McCartney. You mean the Paul McCartney? I mean the Paul McCartney. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. It was in classroom 32 in the building behind me, the Liverpool Institute, where Alan Durband had that talk with Paul McCartney about his voice, as Mr. Harvey explained. It's a very special moment when a teacher is able to reach a student, to make that connection. It's in those rare moments when students become inspired. Those moments are as unpredictable as a lightning strike. When they do happen, it's almost magical. Most teenagers are not looking for inspiration when they're in school, but sometimes it hits them anyway. With proper inspiration, we can achieve almost anything, and Paul McCartney is one good example. In 1969, Paul McCartney said, "School was a complete drag, but there was an English master called Dusty Durband I liked, the only one I did. He was great. He liked modern poetry." It's interesting that Paul nicknamed Alan Durband Dusty Durband. Paul referred to Alan as a real hip English teacher. Paul credited his love of literature to Alan. He once said, "Let it be" appeared in Shakespeare's Hamlet. Paul quoted, "Oh, I could tell you, but let it be. Horatio, I am dead." In an interview, Alan Durband said, "The young man who came to me 8 or 9 years ago then quite undistinguished in the musical world, but not so undistinguished as a student of English, it was in an English class that I knew him best. Towards the end, his guitar playing did get a little much. He was rather late with his essays, and he wasn't doing awfully well in his other two subjects, which he was doing for advanced level, but in English, he had a definite interest. I didn't try to stop him from playing his guitar because it would have been impossible, because he was a young man who knew what he wanted to do. Playing guitar was probably, since the age of 15, an obsession with him. At the age of 18, about a week before he left school, he came to me and asked me my advice. He wanted to know whether he should carry on playing the guitar professionally because he'd been offered a job in Hamburg, Germany, playing the guitar at 20 pounds a week, or whether he should carry on and become a teacher as he'd always intended to be. Well, I'm afraid I gave him the schoolmasterly advice and said, no, you get your qualifications first and then carry on with your guitar playing, because only 1 in a million succeed, and that may not be you. A couple of years later, Alan said Paul came around to see me in a beautiful Aston Martin car. Paul told him, not in a boastful way, that he had made his million. Alan explained with a grin that an Aston Martin was above the salary of a teacher. After the Beatles became so successful, Alan said, I would now advise anyone to do whatever they're hell-bent on doing. You know, Paul and Alan kept in touch through the years. While on tour, Paul would send Alan complimentary tickets to the concerts. When not on tour, Paul occasionally visited Alan. Many of their conversations revolved around literature and poetry. From the time the Beatles became famous, when you saw Alan Durband mentioned in the newspaper, it was almost always accompanied by the clause, Paul McCartney's former English teacher. Alan Durband died in 1993. 3 years later, the old Liverpool Institute school building was saved with the financial support of Paul McCartney and transformed into the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts. Classroom 32, the classroom where Alan taught Paul, was designated with a plaque on the door as the Alan Durband Room. In 1998, artist John King unveiled a sculpture near the school in Liverpool entitled A Case History. The sculpture is composed of colored concrete suitcases piled in waiting to go, or maybe they've just arrived from somewhere. Each case is labeled with the person it belongs to, with each one having a famous owner from the Liverpool region, including social reformers, musicians, writers, and conductors. 2 of those suitcases are labeled Alan Durband. Can you imagine a world where Paul McCartney had taken Alan Durband's advice and became a school teacher? If that had happened, most people wouldn't recognize his name today. Can you imagine a world where the Beatles never existed? Even if you're not a Beatles fan, think of all the bands that came later who were heavily influenced by the Beatles. Without the Beatles, rock and roll would have taken a different direction. Don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.